be recording this session so that we can put it online after the webinar, and for others who couldn't join to be able to benefit from this exchange. So let me try just very quickly to introduce the topic, and we know that trade is really in the focus of everyone's interest nowadays for good or bad reasons, and often we think of trade as in sort of a more traditional sense as an engine of growth. In that also traditional way, we have been assigning trade a very singular role of increasing the pie of national output, and then sort of putting the task of distribution and other share of the benefits of trade to other policies in the country, right? And with time, this view has changed, and so we now pair trade not only with this task of enlarging the pie, but also with many other objectives and purposes. And some people are now talking about multi-purpose trade policies. We talk about trade and many other sort of linkages, etc., etc. I think the most prominent of this pairing of trade with other objectives than just increasing economic benefits is in a context of development, and it started with Millennium Development Goals, and then it continued with Sustainable Development Goals and in general sustainable development. So we expect that trade will be able to just deliver, maybe in the same way as before, but it is not necessarily correct to assume so. And it is, I think, valuable for trade policy purposes and others to understand what are where the expectations are correct and where the expectations are not correct. So we will have opportunity in this webinar to hear about these linkages between trade and sustainable development goals, not only trade, but also the industrial policy, which is often a sort of combined with trade policy. And I think it's very necessary to understand how the linkages can be monitored and whether they can be monitored, and what can we do about evidence that we have through that process. So I think the time is come now for me to introduce our speakers, and we have with us Professor Simon ARTNeT, Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at St. Gallen University. He is the founder of the St. Gallen Endowment for Prosperity Through Trade, and that endowment is now institutional home of something that we all know and use, which is a Global Trade Alert, and more recently also Digital Policy Alert. In 2023 and 2024, Simon is also a co-chair of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on the future of trade. And I think the most important thing is that Simon is or has been ARTNeT advisor since the establishment of ARTNeT in 2005. And our second speaker, or rather discussant, is Professor Ian Coxhead. He is currently a senior research fellow at the Institute of Developing Economies in Japan, but he assumed that position after spending more than 30 years in academia as a professor at University of Wisconsin Madison in the United States. And what also connects Ian with ARTNeT and its institutional home ESCAP is that he has played critical role in putting in place the online course on trade and sustainable development that has proven to be a very successful course. So in terms of the order, we will ask Simon to go through the presentation that will give us more information about the report of the Global Trade Alert that was specifically dedicated to trade and industrial policy linkages and SDGs. That was the, I think, a very significant 30th report of GTA. And then we will ask Ian to comment on that presentation. Then we'll go into the exchange of ideas. Everyone is welcome and invited and encouraged to put their comments or more questions into the chat, and I will be looking at those to then feed them to our speakers as we come to that segment of the webinar. So Simon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mia, and thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share the contents of the 30th Global Trade Alert report with the ARTNeT community. This report is co-authored with Johannes Fritz, my colleague, and I will try and make a joint presentation on it. Now, let's provide some context before I turn to the slides. We have for many years had either a strong policy interest and or academic interest in the links between trade policy and economic development, or in even social forms of development too. There's a long and well-established literature there, which many reputable people have contributed to all over the world, and including in your region, Mia. We also have the Sustainable Development Goals, which are probably humankind's most ambitious development initiative, taking us through to 2030 with a series of elaborate goals and targets which governments have signed up to. And yet there is far less work linking trade policy to the SDGs than you might think, given the high profile nature of the SDGs. And I do not want to suggest that there has been no work done. There is very useful work done by UNCTAD, and I've also seen work from UN ESCAP as well. And there are some academics who have also put together great case studies. But what appears to be missing is some notion of what overall policy stance is linking trade policy to the SDGs. Do we see trade policy moving in a direction which is more conducive to the SDGs? Is it potentially contributing more or less? So big questions like that have not really been answered. And what I want to do in this particular report is just to take a first effort at doing this. And I want to stress that one of the most important features of this particular report was figuring out what you need to put together in order to be able to link trade to the SDGs. And the different components are ones which reasonable people could disagree on, and they could make different choices and approaches. And hopefully by laying out what those choices and choices could involve, others will be encouraged to come forward and improve and take the work forward. So let me raise a few slides, having made those initial comments. So I have a very short slide deck here to share with you. And the report sort of gives away that, the title gives away where we're going to come out, which is that we think the trade and industrial policy could contribute more to the SDGs. In fact, we have a chapter in the report showing how that could be done. But our principal contribution is in basically trying to reduce or fill in a key knowledge gap. And one way of thinking about that knowledge gap is to break the trade policy SDG linkage into 5 questions. And I've listed the 5 questions here on slide 2. So the first question is just how often has commercial policy choice contributed towards attaining different SDG targets? And are the rates of attainment or the rates of contribution the same across SDGs, or do they differ? So that's very much a factual question about policy stance. Second question is, once Agenda 2030 came into effect, did we see a bigger contribution from trade policy? The third question is, did we get blown off course during the COVID-19 pandemic? The fourth question is, and perhaps one which is of importance for many general problem or a particular problem? And last, of course, more policy-oriented, policy prescriptive question, is there room for more commerce liberalizing policy that improves the SDGs? So our report addresses these 5 questions. Now, there are questions that we haven't asked in our report. We have not tried to show the impact of different commercial policy choices on different SDG targets. What we're doing is trying to come up with a way in which you can link SDG targets to commercial policy changes, and then assessing commercial policy stance at points in time and over time. So I want to stress right from the beginning that this is probably best thought of as an effort to try and determine what is existing trade policy stance, linking trade policy to the SDGs, and how does that vary over time and across different income levels of country. All right, so this is the purpose of this presentation really is very much to try and answer some of these questions. What was the scope of our study? Well, as you highlighted, Mia, the team we have at the Singalan Endowment has collected a database of over 50,000 commercial policy interventions, which have been taken worldwide since November 2008. And so this database has become the largest database that covers commercial policy intervention outside of TBT and SBS, those regulatory areas. Outside of those 2 regulatory areas, we track trade and industrial policy interventions in 62 areas of policy. And this includes government procurement measures, FDI measures, subsidy measures, amongst others. Well, we have, of course, the classic trade policy interventions that you would expect as well. So taking this vast database, which we've always used to try and assess whether or not policy is becoming more or less distortive of trade, what we were interested in doing is seeing whether we could make linkages, any links between those policy interventions potentially and the SDGs. And we investigated the SDGs, and in our first round, and we may come back and do more of this, in our first round, we identified that there were 7 SDGs where we thought some linkages between trade policy and industrial policy intervention and SDG indicators could be credibly linked. In order to build those linkages, we needed to do 2 things. First, you have to take a stance on what does an SDG indicator mean. And here we take a very literal reading. So if an SDG indicator talks about the availability of food, for example, we take that as a consumption-based indicator, not a production-based one. A production-based indicator would be, production may contribute to consumption, but in principle, people in a developing country or an industrialized country can consume imported food. So there's no reason why a consumption-based indicator must be linked to domestic production in a world where you can have trade. So we make a literal reading of the SDG indicators and then group them into different types. And then the other thing we did is we have to build a mapping between policy intervention types and their potential impact on an SDG target. So if you have a policy intervention, such as increasing the tariff on some type of imported food, then we need to identify which products and sectors that policy intervention is associated with and which SDG targets are potentially affected. And we need a story, a causal story linking the trade policy change to the potential SDG target. And to do that, we used a classic textbook, short-run, single market, partial equilibrium, perfectly competitive model. Now, for the non-economists, That's probably a mouthful, but I have to say that because this is an important design choice. And what we did, because we are trying to break new ground here, is we didn't come up with our own particular economic model. We took the one that just about anyone who has taken an international trade course at an undergraduate level will have been exposed to. So that simple partial single market model, which we all studied at university and possibly even before university, that's the model we're going to use for better or for worse. And as I'll say later, people may decide that they would have a different type of framework. So this type of economic model looks at the effects of policy intervention within a given market. It does not look at knock-on effects across markets, either within the same country or across countries. So this is a very particular, but very well-known economic model. So we need that model to be able to turn around and make inferences of, say, the impact of a tariff increase in food on the availability of food to a domestic population. As you can tell, the different components we've brought together here are threefold. First, you need an underlying database of trade policy intervention. Second, you need to choose which SDG indicators you're looking at and interpret them. And third, you need a mapping linking them together. And these are the three elements which anyone who wants to make progress in this area needs to put together. And reasonable people may differ on how they do this. So someone else may have a different database they want to use, not the Global Trade Alert one. Some people may be more interested in other SDGs, fair enough. And some people may have a different economic model that links the policy interventions to the SDGs of choice. And so that's why we emphasize that this report is not the last word on this topic. To be honest, we actually wanted to just to lay out what it takes to build such a mapping and then see what the findings are. Well, talking of findings, I'm going to summarize the findings on orally now on this slide, and then I'm going to have some charts. Now, I've been in this business long enough to know that some people like charts and some people don't. So and some people prefer text. So I'm going to give you both, if you don't mind. And I'm going to start with the textual slide with 5 findings. The first is that when you look at commercial policy interventions in the Global Trade Alert database, about 45% of them have likely contributed to the SDG targets since the adoption of Agenda 2030. Okay? So 45% had some type of impact. That means there's a lot of commercial policy intervention which is not affecting any of the SDG targets that we study. And so one has to differentiate between the two. Second key finding is that the percentage of likely positive contributions from trade policy to the SDGs did not rise with the adoption of Agenda 2030. That is, they did not rise after 2016. What we did see after 2016 is an increase in the number of commercial policy interventions of about a third on an annual basis. The annual rate went up by a third. But the percentage of policy interventions affecting SDG targets has actually fallen. So the policy intervention affecting SDGs has only gone up by 10% as compared to a 32% overall increase in trade policy action. And so the percentage of intervention overall, which is likely to be impacting SDGs, has actually fallen. The third finding, and is one which I think will attract some comment, and that is that policies which liberalize economies and open them up to trade and investment, there appears to be a tension between those policies and attaining SDG 9. And that tension is the biggest in SDG 9. It stands out like a sore thumb, as you'll see in the data. And that tension is at the least in SDGs 1 and 6. So the SDGs differ in the extent to which opening up trade policy is likely to affect the SDG targets when you read those SDG targets literally, as I said we did earlier. The fourth finding, we find that COVID-19 did not set back the impact of trade policy on SDGs. So there was no COVID-19 disruption in this sense. Of course, COVID-19 was very disruptive in many other senses, but in terms of the measures of trade policy stance that we report in the report, surprisingly few are blown off course by COVID. And then what we show is, in one of the concluding chapters, is that other than SDG 9, it would be possible to design trade and industrial policies that liberalize commerce in a way that improves SDG outcomes. And for SDG 9, which is of course based on private sector development, there the question has to be asked whether trade policy is the right tool to develop the private sector, and whether or not there are better non-trade distorting measures out there. Now, the trade literature has for decades had a very clear view on this question, and that is that trade policy measures are second or third best policy interventions, that there are better interventions out there. And so with that in mind, one might then want to rethink the degree to which we expect trade policy to contribute to SDG 9. Let me quickly show you some of the findings in tables and charts. So of the 7 SDGs that we studied, this table shows you that we have 37,000 policy interventions in our database that we think can be credibly linked to one of these 7 SDGs. The amount of information we have on each SDG varies significantly. And about half of the information in our database, the Global Trade Alert database, that is relevant in the study relates to the years before Agenda 2030 was implemented, and the other half is since the agenda has been implemented. So 19,672 measures relate to the period when Agenda 2030 came into effect. Maybe in terms of the policy interventions that contribute to this, as you can see in the last column, there are between 100 and 200 countries' policy interventions that contribute to the findings in each of these SDGs. So our study, in effect, or our database, is not concentrated on any one group of countries. So it's not focusing excessively on industrialized countries or on developing countries. It's quite broad-based, which is appropriate for a global study. And when you look in the 4th column, you can see that the share of commercial policy interventions that contribute positively towards an SDG indicator varies a lot. The average overall is 45%, but it varies between not 20% and 76%. Interestingly, only a quarter of commercial policy interventions that liberalize commerce contribute to the SDGs, and that varies across the SDGs as well, as is shown in the 5th column of this table. So this is a summary table giving you some sense of how policy stance since the Agenda 2030 has come into effect, how trade policy stance has or has not contributed towards the SDG indicators. And some people will be worried about some of these numbers being either too high or too low, and let's talk about that. Let me show you some data on what's happened before and after Agenda 2030 came into effect. On the left-hand side, we have a plot of the share of policy interventions that have a positive impact on the SDGs before 2016 and after 2016. The fact that these points are pretty much lining up on the 45-degree line tells you that the policy stance has not really changed that much, or at least commercial policy stance has not really changed that much in terms of its contribution to SDGs since Agenda 2030 came into effect. Having said that, when you get more granular and you look at different SDGs, you can see that there are changes. So if we look at SDG 3 on the right-hand side in this chart, you can see 4 groups of countries identified, that is high income, low income, upper middle income, and lower middle income. These are the World Bank's groupings of countries. And what we've done is to plot the share of interventions that have a positive impact on the SDGs against the share which are liberalizing, and you can see there are changes over time. So we see in low-income countries for SDG 3 a big increase in the share of liberalizing interventions and a big increase in the share of interventions having a positive impact on the SDGs. So if you're looking for an SDG positive story, this would be it. Interestingly, we see the same for the lower middle income countries, moving in the right direction on both criteria. For upper middle income countries, we get regression, fewer liberalizing measures, fewer positive impacts on the SDG 3. And for high income countries, we have less liberal policies, yet at the same time, given the way the SDGs are constructed in this particular SDG 3, we do see a slight improvement in the number of or share of policy interventions having a positive impact. So you do have very interesting variation across countries. As a general rule in our report, we found much more positive stories for the lower income countries, perhaps fewer for the higher income countries, and very mixed results for the middle income countries. So there does appear to be differences across income classes, which you can dig into in the report. And we have a separate annex for each of the 7 SDGs. So this gives you a sense about the changes in the commercial policy stance and its link to SDGs over time. When it comes to when it comes to the tension potentially between policy interventions that open up trade and attain the SDGs, what we have on the left-hand side is for the period before 2016 and then on the vertical axis from the period from the beginning of Agenda 2030 through to the pandemic, we plot the share of interventions where there is a trade-off or a tension. That is, where liberalizing trade worsens an SDG indicator. And it's pretty clear from this chart that on the left-hand side that SDG 9 stands out. And the reason here is that SDG 9 is largely about measures which increase the producer surplus or profitability or the employment chances or employment levels in the private sector. And in the simple economic model that we learned at university, increases in trade restrictions will lead to domestic production increasing. And so this drives the result, I think, for SDG 9. In contrast, SDGs 1 and 6 show very little tension, and there are moderate levels of tension in the other 4. Now, the chart on the right-hand side compares 2016 and 19 with the pandemic era. And so you can see here that the tension appears to grow in 5 of the SDGs, but not by much. And so, the argument here then is that the pandemic may have mattered, may have shifted policy in a way where there appears to be more of a tension between SDGs attainment and commercial policy, but we are not talking big shifts, and the breakdown of the SDGs into 3 groups still remains. So this issue of the tension between SDGs and openness is still very much on the table. Let me just wrap up with some caveats and concluding remarks. Let me emphasize that our approach is best thought of as characterizing policy stance and changes in that stance over time and their impact on their links to the SDGs. We do not estimate the effects of commercial policy stance on the SDGs. Anyone who wants to estimate the effects will have to do the exercise that we have gone through. So you can think about our report as an input to that subsequent important work on estimating effects. As I indicated earlier, the findings in our report are based on a mapping which has 3 elements: the chosen SDG indicators, the model chosen, and the data set chosen. If you change any one of these 3 things, you probably will get different results, but at least we know what the different elements are, and we can use this report as a benchmark so that others who make other choices, we can begin to see how those other choices change the results, if at all. When we look across the 7 SDGs, generalization is probably unwise. The relationship between commercial policy and the 7 SDGs we studied was quite different. However, when you look over time, generalization is on much more solid ground. So we tend to find the intertemporal comparisons and patterns are pretty stable, and so maybe one can be surer of any claims, general claims made in that area. Otherwise, if you're looking at SDGs, then we recommend that you look SDG by SDG to see what the links are between commercial policy and trade policy. That's important because it suggests that anyone who wants to suggest that trade policy has no role in the SDGs is probably overplaying it. And those people who expect trade policy to fix every SDG are probably on dangerous territory as well. Okay, and our hope, and the last point here is that by tagging trade policy intervention according to its potential SDG target impact, this tagging is possible. That is what we have demonstrated in this report. And we hope that this facilitates better policy choice ex ante and a better ex post evaluation of policy impacts. And so for the policy community, the policymaking community, the ability to be able to, or to know that a policy intervention in a particular good or sector is likely to have an SDG impact may be valuable for those governments which are determined to align their trade policies with the SDGs. Thank you very much for your time. Ian, it appears that we have lost Mia, which I'm sure is only a temporary thing, a temporary state of affairs. Do you want to dive in and provide your comments and keep the webinar flowing?
Yeah, sure. I guess I wonder where she's gone and whether she'll come back. So let me get started anyway, and I'm sure that Mia will rejoin us. So Simon, thank you very much for those. I'm in the embarrassing position of having more slides as a discussant than you do as a presenter. So thank you very much for that very concise presentation. And it's really the report that you've described. I've had a chance to read through the body of it as well. Very, very detailed quantitative work, and that kind of attention to detail, that meticulous approach is a very valuable one indeed. And I can see that the database that underlies the report is unique and a very valuable one as well, especially as you said in your very last remark there, as a tool for policy assessment, both in the design of policies with the SDG criteria in mind, and in the assessment of policy impacts, again, with SDG criteria in mind. That's really a fascinating approach. Let me pause for a moment while I figure out that I'm going to share my screen. So let's go here and press play, and I assume that that's that you can see on screen now my presentation. So so I want to kind of begin from a couple of the points that you raised at the very beginning of your talk, and then go off in a somewhat different direction. And predictably enough, as a trade economist, you might expect that where we're going to diverge is on the assumptions that you made in constructing the mapping from your database to the SDG targets. And I want to kind of use my opportunity here to reflect a little bit on how that mapping might look, and how different approaches to that mapping might produce different results. So where do we begin? Obviously, the fourth and fifth questions that you posed at the start are really critical, motivating questions. Are there tensions between liberalizing policy and attaining SDG targets? Is there room for liberalizing policies to improve SDG outcomes? And both of those, I think, are really first order questions that relate to our topic today. And you've mentioned at a couple of points the kind of different kinds of uncertainty about the links between trade and SDGs. I think that's very much reflected in the text of the Agenda 30 documents. I'll come to that in just a moment. And it's also very much reflected in, as you know as well, in policy discussions about the links between trade and the SDGs as well. And I'm going to have something to say about that now, and then again at the end of my remarks, and that is that uncertainty, that is lack of clarity about the ways in which trade relates to SDGs, I think is something that really does feed skepticism, both about the nature of those links and also about the potential sign. So if you're inclined to take a pessimistic view of trade as a tool for economic growth and development, then the way in which the SDGs are framed and the justification, particularly for the role of trade, will not really change your mind at all, right? If you're pessimistic about trade, there's nothing much in the SDG documents and approaches, targets, that's going to change your mind. And I worry about that a lot. So I'll come back to that at the very end. But let me now turn to what I think is a really important issue for development economists, and that is thinking about the kind of mapping that links the trade data or the trade policy database to the SDG indicator database, as you have so accurately and carefully described it. And my question is, well, how should we construct such a mapping? I've summarized your approach here: the short-run single market, partial equilibrium, perfect competitive model. And then the question, of course, that you and I both appreciate very much is, well, when will this model give us the right answers? And when will it advance the case for commercial policy as a tool for achieving SDG outcomes? And this is not to disagree at all with the way that you've gone about the modeling in your report, because, as you said, got to start somewhere. So what I'll do here is, I guess, just dig down one level a little bit on a couple of topics and see what we can acquire in the way of additional information. So here's what I think is the sort of key statement from the Agenda 30 document, which is international trade is an engine for inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction, and contributes to sustainable development. But we all know, if we read this document, that after that, the references to trade, and in particular the clear, I would say, analytically based references, are very, very scarce indeed. And there's almost really, not only is there not much guidance on the mechanisms by which trade might influence SDGs, but there is also almost no guidance on the ways in which such a relationship might play out, might become a successful or create a successful outcome. And I think a problem here, well, we could say one problem is that there weren't enough trade economists involved in the writing of that document. Maybe it's really the case that there were lots of compromises reached, and the balance of optimism and pessimism about trade and the SDGs probably resulted in kind of a non-stance. Maybe that's the way it works. I wasn't in the room. But really a very big analytical challenge is that the linkages that we're thinking about are, for the most part, very indirect, and not only indirect, but also conditional on the way in which particular markets in particular countries work, the way in which they're influenced by institutions, and the way in which, of course, they're subject to domestic policy. So let me say a little bit about this without hopefully exceeding my time limit. First thing that we know about trade and the SDGs is that to the extent that trade raises total income in the economy, it has an enormously beneficial effect. And that's independent of any direct SDG outcome. One way to think about this is that if you increase income in general, then you hugely reduce the cost of achieving the very basic SDG targets, like SDGs 1 to 4, that is, eliminating poverty, reducing hunger, achieving basic norms of healthcare, and basic literacy as well. These things really matter, and all of these, of course, are much more easily attained when incomes are rising than when incomes are not. If trade raises incomes, then it makes all of these targets much, much easier to achieve. A great example, of course, is the ready-made garment export boom in Bangladesh, starting from around the beginning of the 1990s and extending for about 20 years. That's a direct product of trade policy initiatives. From the outside, it's easier access for Bangladesh's exports to developed country markets, like the European Union's everything but arms deal. And then it's domestically due to things like tariff cuts on upstream industries, that is the yarn and thread and other industries in Bangladesh, that made inputs to the ready-made garment industry much cheaper. What were the effects of these? Well, lots and lots of new jobs, jobs offering higher wages, and concomitant with that, an enormous fall in poverty, so that Bangladesh dropped down through the ranks of poor countries, from having about 45% headcount poverty in 1991 to under 15% by 2016. Just an enormous change. And almost all of that, I think, coming just from the income effect of more open trade, allowing an industry to flourish. So what is the mechanism that drives that? It's really important to understand this clearly. So trade exploits abundant resources in the case of Bangladesh and many other countries like it, that is low-skill labor. So through the trade and FDI mechanism, we get increased demand for labor that produces higher wages and higher incomes, with very big direct effects on those who are employed in the affected industries, the trade affected industries, but equally large effects, indirect, on linked industries. Think about construction and personal services and other industries that grow alongside the industrial zones. Also linked labor markets, because many of the workers in the new industries, migrants from rural areas, and of course links to source communities through remittances sent back by those migrants as well. However, when we think about each of those things, then it becomes very clear that the extent of the gain and the distribution of gain from trade is really conditional on the way in which policies and institutions affect labor mobility. At the extreme, if labor can't move, then industries won't expand. And if industries don't expand, then the gains from trade will be very, very small. Another way of thinking about it, if institutions that govern things like child labor and labor formality and labor conditions are weak, then the potential for a race to the bottom kind of expansion of jobs is also possible. And that's, of course, in direct contradiction with key SDG targets. So in general, we can think about the benefits of trade through the labor market linkage as conditional on institutions and policies. That's what this cute little flowchart is suggesting. That if we have strong institutions and supportive policies, then we get good outcomes in terms of SDGs. If institutions are weak and or policies are contradictory, then we get a much higher probability of bad outcomes, including the exploitation of vulnerable workers and, of course, the expansion of 3D, dirty, difficult, and dangerous type jobs. The chart on the right, if you just focus on the upper one, indicates some of those complementary conditions. For example, spending on social services in low income and even lower middle income countries is very, very low relative to that in upper middle, proportionally very low relative to that in upper middle income and high income countries. And the big lesson from this, which is embedded in the report that Simon reported on, is that if you want to get two kinds of outcomes, that is, improve trade and also hit certain SDG goals, you're almost certainly going to need two kinds of policies. This is known as the Tinbergen rule. Trade will not be a panacea. Okay, very, very quickly, I've talked about labor. We can also think about environmental issues in exactly the same way. Income growth makes countries better able to manage their environmental and natural resource assets in a way that's compatible with the SDGs, but that's only going to happen if other things are also in place. So think about very weak property rights in a natural resource such as forests or fisheries. Then, of course, trade can easily create opportunities which will cause a despoilation of those resources or a rapid and unsustainable depletion of those resources. I've highlighted Indonesia's oil palm boom here. That's, of course, a complex story, but it does capture many of the basic ideas here. And another thing about Indonesia is that it draws our attention to the difference between income growth, which I've talked about already, and something more like a spending effect. That is, a very big gain in income to a relatively small sector of the population or a small part of the economy, but which then gets distributed through extra or additional spending. Now, that spending often takes the place of increased demand for services such as household help, restaurants, hotels, local trade and transport, construction, and so on, which may or may not result in the creation of new good jobs, or decent work, as the ILO likes to call it, because a lot of the jobs that get created through that spending effect are in informal industries, which are notoriously low skill, unstable, and insecure. So again, the interaction between trade and institutions is a really, really important one. So does trade or trade liberalization help or hinder progress on SDGs? The answer is going to be specific to countries and to SDGs, and of course to trade policy instruments, and it's going to depend a lot not on trade itself, but on other complementary conditions. Now, my time is almost up. This is the last slide. How do we go forward from here? Well, there's no question that the income effects of trade are beneficial by reducing the costs of achieving the very basic SDGs. No doubt about that in any country. But if we want to get broader gains, then we have to address vulnerabilities in terms of the interactions of humans with the economy, and of course the interactions of trade with the environmental variables that we're interested in as well. So in order to map the effects of trade onto SDG targets, specific SDG targets in specific countries, we, I think, have to be very judicious in the tools that we choose. We have to think about choosing tools that will help us to identify the most influential mechanisms at work. In particular, take account of general equilibrium or intersectoral costs and benefits, and of course, to identify policies that can correct things like distortions or externalities that will matter for SDG outcomes. So let me finish with a rhetorical note and a policy problem. The rhetorical note, let's come back to that skepticism about trade's benefits for the SDGs that I mentioned at the start and which Simon also mentioned. That skepticism is usually misplaced. It's not really about the effects of trade. It's about interactions of trade with misplaced policies or bad policies or weak institutions. And if we can solve the institutional policy problems, then trade benefits are going to be much clearer and in general, much more positive as well. Think about environmental damage as a really good example of that. And then the policy problem, the necessary reforms to make that happen are almost all in the domain of domestic policy. They can't be achieved by sitting around in international policy forums and figuring out what to do. They are the responsibility of individual countries, taking care of property rights, taking care of labor laws and protections for vulnerable workers, and all of these other things are, of course, the domain of domestic policy. And so we can conclude from that it won't be easy. Okay, thank you all very much for that, for tolerating all of that. And I'll finish here and we can, I guess, begin with discussion. Is Mia back? You are back, Mia. You are back, but you're muted.
Can you hear me at all?
We can hear you now.
Okay, great. I'm really sorry. I don't know what sort of technical cyclone or whatever problems we have here in Kiwiland, but it's really unfortunate, and I apologize, but I hope you understand I have no control over that. Simon, do you want to respond perhaps first to some of the excellent comments that Ian was putting forward before we open the floor?
Let me just quickly thank Ian for these, I think, highly complimentary remarks, because he's highlighted exactly the point I had hoped he would, which is that if you take a different view of what the trade and development process is, then you are going to see different linkages between trade policy and the SDGs. And I think he's also made, I think, a very good point, which is that the impact of trade and trade policy on economic growth will spill over onto the SDGs as well. And this is something which a more elaborate mapping could try and take account of. So I see Ian's comments very much in the spirit of let's start building these mappings, and when we factor in experience which has been seen in the Asia Pacific region, and he gave lots of examples from the Asia Pacific region, then we can see how a mapping could be elaborated to add to what we have already done. So thank you, Ian. I think very, very grateful for the comments.
Yes, thank you. I'm sorry I lost a bit of your presentation, Simon, and I don't know if you have gone into that area. I tried to quickly read in the PowerPoints, but you see, I think both of you have focused quite a bit of the trade liberalization and the linkages. But what we are seeing nowadays as a policy choice is really not trade liberalization. It is imposition of various restrictions to trade and management of trade through different policies as instruments. So what is the, what do we do about that? And does that reduce, Simon, some of the conflicts that you have found, for example, in SDG 9? Because the premise of putting these constraints is to enable the achievement of these goals that appear to be in conflict with liberalization, right? So, I would like you to go a little bit more into it, unless you have done it when I was away. So, say so.
So thank you, Mia. Let me try and respond. So just so that everyone on the call knows, the Global Trade Alert database includes measures which liberalize trade and also restrict trade or distort it. And both were used in our study. Depending on which country or which time period you look at, between 2/3 and 3/4 of all the policy interventions recorded in the GTA database are trade distortive. So, and we have certainly picked up the shift that you have identified in your question, Mia. Now, how does this affect the results? Let's start with SDG 9. Imagine we have an SDG indicator there, which talks about increasing manufacturing value added. It may be in sustainable industries or alike. In a classic textbook economic analysis of that, if you raise import tariffs or you put in place some other trade restriction, which keeps out imports in a country which was importing the good to start with, this will increase the manufacturing value added. And that's exactly the tension which is called out in SDG 9. That's exactly the tension that we see in the results for SDG 9, is that the short run effect of trade restrictions will be to improve some of those SDG indicators if you read those SDG indicators literally. Now, notice I also use the word short run, because there's quite a lot of quite a lot of analysis which suggests that over the medium to longer term, firms and industries which are protected from international competition tend to suffer from cost disease or Baumol's cost disease or other ways in which their competitiveness falls. But again, what you're doing there is shifting from the textbook framework which we used to a different framework, and that's just perfectly fine. But we need to be very clear about what framework we're using, and then we'll not necessarily get agreement even amongst trade economists as to which one is the right one to use. So I think all of that stuff is the foundations for going into that in even greater depth are all in our report, and we definitely cover the increasing shift towards trade distortions.
Thank you. Ian, do you have any additional comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's quite right to focus on SDG 9, which is the goal whose targets address infrastructure development, industrialization, moving up the industrial value chain, and a variety of other things like that. These are all, of course, fantastic targets. I guess just to kind of highlight a little bit more one of the points made by Simon, it's one thing to set a target like this, it's another to achieve it. And the question I think that must be raised is what kind of cost will it entail to do that? And what's the opportunity cost of trying to achieve an industrialization goal as opposed to some other path to achieving the SDGs? With the industrialization target, that's an area where you get these kind of rather curious statements in the SDG document, right? So SDG 9 target 2, I think it is, calls for doubling the share of industry in the least developed economies. Now, I don't understand the logic of a quantitative target of that kind, and I don't understand the conditions under which that would uniformly be a good thing. And I certainly don't understand what cost it would require to achieve that target as opposed to many of the other SDG targets, and the two are most likely to come into direct contrast or direct conflict. So let's think about ways in which more open trade policies might actually be beneficial for developing countries. The most obvious examples, I think, are those in which trade liberalization actually facilitates domestic industrial growth. I mentioned Bangladesh in my remarks. One of the keys to Bangladesh's success in the ready-made garment industry was removing barriers to imports of inputs to that industry, thereby making them cheaper, making access to better quality inputs more readily available, and so on. That's one of the keys to success of that industry, and without that, they would not have succeeded. Just look at Pakistan, if you want an example of that. Another great example, I think, is Indonesia, where a very important study by Mary Amity and others showed that when the input markets for Indonesian manufacturing firms were liberalized, that is, they could buy their inputs more cheaply in global markets than sourcing from domestic markets, productivity was raised in all of those industries. And higher productivity isn't just an industry benefit, it also means those industries grow faster, create more jobs, pay better wages, and so on. So the aggregate effects are really enormous. So I think maybe in evaluating SDG impacts of commercial policy, it's really important to, especially for ex-ante policy formation, I think, to distinguish those policies which are going to threaten an existing protected industry, a target of industrial policy, versus those which will promote industrial growth.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. I will need to ask you, you two, Ian and Simon, to help me discover if there are any questions in the chat, because I can't see them on my phone. And so if there are questions, or if there are people that would like to ask questions, maybe they can indicate by just showing on a camera and asking a question at this point.
No questions so far that I can see.
All right. And any of the participants, if they're willing to ask a question, maybe this is a good time, if they can hear me. If not, I would like to ask something else, again, related, to the current sort of role of the or a lack of the leading role of the WTO in negotiations, and then negotiations in the area of trade policies being really dominantly in the domain of regional trade agreements or even bilateral trade agreements. And then it seems that in the area of what is negotiated now, that countries tend to put some of these non-trade or non-economic objectives like national security, or some that belong to sustainable development, as non-negotiable and not in the area of quid pro quo. So the area of the actual gains related to trade liberalization may be a little bit reduced. Do you have any comment on that? If you can follow me, I don't.
So yeah, Mia, Simon here, just trying to reflect on what you've said, and maybe also a little bit on what Ian said as well. Noticing in our approach, we did not challenge the formulation of any of the SDGs, and whether either the text of them or the logic underlying them. And Ian's last comments, I think, speak to an important point, which is that there are many people in the trade policy community who do not see an intellectual coherence or logic to some of the SDG indicators, and that clearly came out when I did the research for this particular report. I mean, we are, as a community, I don't think we're 100% aligned behind the SDGs at all, and there are, I think, interesting reasons for that. Now, and talking of misalignment, I suspect a lot of the trade policy community is not particularly aligned with the direction that some governments are going with on national security matters, and trying to use that to carve out space which where trade policy and trade policy deliberation is not encouraged. And of course, the more that we start imposing constraints of that nature on the trading system and executing them either through unilateral action or through accords between governments, then of course this is going to make it harder to use trade policy to attain the SDGs, if indeed that's the right thing to do. So I think we are operating in an increasingly crowded space. One way of looking at what's happened is over the last 10 years is that expectations of trade policy with respect to development have increased. And the SDGs is a manifestation of that, but also expectations of trade's contribution to other societal goals like national security has also gone up too. And these are developments which are not necessarily overwhelmingly welcomed, I think, by my colleagues when I hear them speak.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, Ian was quite right to mention this somewhat incomprehensible definitions of some of the targets, in particular when there is a complete absence of data behind those, and yet the targets do actually speak about quantitative or some other achievements, right? So there is a bit of incoherence in that structure. From what I recall, that was the consequence of having many stakeholders involved in the definition of the goals and the targets, and so everyone was supposed to get a little bit of what they were expecting. So in moving forward, because it's obvious that that the SDGs and will not be met as was planned. Simon, can we learn something from this study about how do we go about defining the goals themselves, and so that we are in a better position to perhaps also use the monitoring in designing the policies later on?
This is a great question, Mia, because I think one of the things I took from looking across the different SDG indicators is that they can be grouped. So some SDG indicators are ones which are really focused on increasing consumption or access to certain things like medicines. Some are about reducing consumption, say to alcohol. Others are about increasing production, or in some cases, reducing production and or emissions. And I think we can group the different legitimate development targets that there are into these different groups, and then ask the question that Ian asked, and I think any trade economist would ask, which is, where is trade policy the best response to any of these particular targets, and then focus our attention or our expectations about where trade policy should contribute on those targets where we think trade policy has the most direct positive effect when you take account of any of the adverse knock-on effects. I think that's an organizing logic which would help pass the current set of SDG targets, and at least for as far as the trade policy community and the part of it that wants to use the SDGs as a vehicle, this might be a way, the way I've just described, of focusing the discussion going forward, focusing the monitoring, focusing the analysis. I'd be interested to hear if Ian disagrees.
I'm not going to do. I would be foolish to disagree with any of that. As for the process through which the SDGs or similar kinds of UN initiatives are formed, I have no idea about any of that, and I can imagine that there's a lot of horse trading and compromising that goes on in the creation of those things. So my instinct is that those involved in the formulation of or assessment of policy ex ante should probably be selective about how to about the SDG targets and, implicitly, I guess, prioritize them now. Sure, that involves making judgment calls that we're not necessarily empowered to make, but I can't see any other way around doing that. Mia, let me come back to your first question about industrial policy. I think that there's an important thing to be asked there. You kind of asked the question, well, if we are turning away from trade as a global community, or at least getting less enthusiastic about liberalization, what does that mean for SDG attainment? I think that's really a very important question. It's no accident that the fastest period of global poverty alleviation begins in about 1991 and runs for, around about 20 years to the onset of the global financial crisis. That is a period during which, of course, the WTO was formed. The idea of trade, liberalized trade as a key to economic interactions and economic structure was, I think, most widely accepted during this time. And it's not only no accident, but it's also no coincidence that the opening up of the global economy and of individual markets within that economy during that period was a direct contributor to the reduction in global poverty. Just look at China, for example, and India as really great examples of that. So if we're going to go backwards on these kinds of policies now, then there's no doubt in my mind, at least, that the adoption of industrial policies that limit trade is also going to slow progress towards the most important SDGs, that is poverty, hunger, and so on. And that's going to happen both through domestic channels. Protectionism is expensive, and we learn all of that in International Economics 101. That story hasn't gone away yet. And then internationally, there are lots of spillovers to think about. So as the wealthy countries get less enthusiastic about offering trade concessions or even just engaging in trade with the rest of the world, then they cut off opportunities for the poorer countries, and especially the least developed countries, to begin climbing the ladder of industrialization by reshoring industries like garment, footwear, simple electronics, and things like that. They take away opportunities for growth. And that, I think, is really reprehensible.
Yeah, well, I agree with everything you, Ian, and Simon, you said on that. And I think when we look at the opportunities that trade has created for the developing countries to actually start catching up, this seems now to be sort of losing the ground, right? And less and less of the developing countries see the less and less of those countries see the opportunity to actually increase their standard of living and well-being through trade, given all the complexities in trade policies, in their trading partners that are not necessarily related to orthodox trade policies like tariffs or quotas, but non-tariff barriers and many barriers that are now related to the sort of secondary restrictions, right? And also in the digital sphere. So I would like to be optimist in terms of trade continuing to be the tool of the sustainable and inclusive development. And so maybe I think we have 1 or 2 minutes each. If you can leave us with the message of what should be done for trade to continue to play such an important role historically, but I would say in future as well. Shall we start with Ian and then end with Simon?
Okay, thank you very much. So I think if I were to choose just one thing that really matters, it would be anything that can be done to tease apart the effects of trade from its interactions with weak institutions and bad policies. Because I think if you want to build because there is no question to my mind that trade is good for progress towards SDGs, as long as those other things are in place. To the extent that there is a lack of enthusiasm or even outright pessimism for trade as a tool, or for trade policy as a tool for achieving the SDGs, I believe that pessimism or lack of enthusiasm is misplaced. I think it's a misinterpretation of the conditions under which trade impacts an economy, rather than trade itself. And so I would say the one thing that we should really try to change is to build a better analytical understanding in the policy community of the benefits of trade, and show how they are conditional on domestic policy improvements.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ian. Simon?
So let me add a different proposal. By the way, I endorse Ian's. So let me add one more, which is that it would be great to know a lot more about how trade policies contributed to the cross-border transfer of technologies and associated knowledge, because often it is countries getting their hands on better, or companies or individuals getting their hands on technologies which have been developed abroad, which provides one way of catching up with what's going on at the frontier faster. So I think emphasis on, or some emphasis on, the links between trade policy and the diffusion of innovations and improvements abroad would be a useful place to start. And one could look in certain sectors, like diffusion of medical technologies, or nets for malaria, things like this, or you can even go into the manufacturing and the digital space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for ending on that note related to innovation, because I think we often neglect to talk about that. Obviously, we always believe that trade is instrumental in transfer of technology and knowledge and ideas, etc. But it's important to make a reference to that with respect to new sources of innovation and knowledge that is not necessarily just in the production technology, but is also, I need to say, it is also related to mobility of people as well, which we haven't had opportunity to talk about, but it's definitely related to SDGs and sustainable development as well. Well, with this, I would like to thank you very much, not only for the great contribution to sharing this wonderful report, Simon, with the ARTNeT community and your very high quality comments, Ian, as always, but also for your great patience and tolerance in my moderating this session, as being absent for half of the session, and thank you very much for stepping in such a good camaraderie manner. I think this shows how valuable the relationship through art and community are, so that we can actually function as a team, even though we didn't talk about the possibility of having to do so. So thank you so much, and I hope this will not prevent you from coming to speak to us again in ARTNeT webinar. I will definitely make sure that we have better technology in place. And thank you to participants. I'm sorry I was not able to include you very much in the discussion, because I really didn't have a clue who is there and where, and asking or possibly wanting to ask questions. So we'll do better next time when we join. All the best to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, Mia.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Simon.
Thank you very much, Mia. Thanks.
Yeah.
Bye.